Professor Beck earned her PhD in economics at the University of Pennsylvania. She began teaching at UD actually before completing her dissertation and has been on the faculty here ever since then. She's taught graduate and undergraduate courses in macroeconomics, in international economics, and international finance. She's supervised dissertations in these areas, and her publications include work on commodity markets, future markets, hyperinflation dynamics, international finance, particularly on foreign exchange rate movements and capital flows, some very timely topics these days. Her current research is on tax effects on international competitiveness, and in particular, the effect of taxes on the terms of trade, exports, and foreign direct investment. Please welcome Professor Stacie Beck.
The Nobel Prize winners in economics are two U.S. economists, Thomas Sargent and Christopher Sims, for empirical work on the role of cause and effect in the macroeconomy, particularly in the conduct of monetary policy. Okay. In macroeconomic policy analysis, the effect of the public's expectations are very important, and this creates an especial difficulty in determining whether the policy works. One might ask, for example, does a certain type or size of a tax increase discourage spending? By how much? Or will a drop in the Federal Reserve's target interest rate increase spending, and by how much? And what does the data say? This is not a straightforward problem, as we shall see. Sargent and Sims started their research at a turbulent time in the field of macroeconomics. Prior to the 1970s, economists relied on large linear equations estimated on historical data and are designed around the Keynesian model. Many of its assumptions were built into these models. They were used for forecasting and policy analysis. Toward the end of the 1960s and into the 70s, these models began to fail. This is most dramatically illustrated by the Phillips curve, the hitherto inverse relationship between inflation and unemployment. Now, this is the 1960s, where you can see it looks like a pretty tight relationship. But this is what happened in the 70s. Yeah. And then it didn't get better. Okay. So, as you can see, the relationship held up in the 60s, began to fall apart in the 70s, and it didn't get better. Prior to this time, the empirical relationship would be observed, then we would estimate that and justify it ex post, and then use it to project the future. In the case of the Phillips curve, as in throughout these models, it was assumed that the public formed expectations, did not form expectations. Or if they did, they were systematically wrong. In the case of the Phillips curve, it was assumed that the public misinterpreted increases in the price level as increases in demand rather than it being inflation, and so they increased output. And what would happen is policymakers would exploit that misperception by using monetary policy to create a little of inflation and reduce the unemployment rate. However, obviously that didn't work in the 1970s anymore. So inspired by work by Friedman and Phelps and chastised by the failure of these traditional models, macroeconomists re-examined the role of expectations. What emerged was a new modeling technique called rational expectations. So I'll give you an example. The impact of a tax decrease on consumption spending may depend on whether the consumers perceive it as causing their taxes down the road to go up. So in other words, the government might run a bigger national debt that may raise taxes down the road. So rather than spending that tax rebate, they may not spend it, or they may spend less of it. In this case, their expectations actually influence the policy. And consequently, the economy may not recover the way it was expected to, This would, of course, cause possibly the policymakers to have to extend the tax cut and raise national debt further, and feeds back into the expectations of the public. So we have a back and forth problem that's hard to disentangle. As an example of this type of problem, there was kind of an interesting discussion about the multiplier impact of the stimulus package. At a session at the American Economics Association, John Taylor argued that the stimulus would increase GDP by only 80 cents of every dollar spent, and Lawrence Cristiano said it would increase GDP by $1.20. And after comparing all the different assumptions, it turned out the key parameter were, in fact, these expectations. John Taylor assumed that we're all a little more rational than Lawrence Cristiano did. And as a consequence of that, John Taylor thought it would not work, and Lawrence Cristiano thought it would. One of Sargent's most famous paper explored the implications of rational expectations with respect to the Phillips curve. Sargent, along with Wallace, showed that rational expectations formed by the public eliminated any benefit monetary policy has on unemployment unless it were unanticipated. Subsequent theoretical work showed that because the central bank has an incentive to fool the public may anticipate that and raise their prices in response. So this changed the policy question from a type of optimal control problem to a more of a game theoretic problem. The practical effect of this research, started by Sargent and Wallace, was that many central banks adopted inflation rate targeting as a policy rule, with the important exception of the US Federal Reserve. Many economists saw the adoption of this practice as a big factor in the Great Moderation, which was what we call the period from 1985 to about 2006, where we were able to reduce business cycles were reduced. Nevertheless, in their widely cited article, Unpleasant Monetarist Arithmetic, Sargent and Wallace warn that a contractionary monetary policy alone is not enough to stave off inflation if government budget deficits are out of control. A line of research that followed from this problem of what is called fiscal dominance suggests that inflation could occur regardless of what a central bank does if the public becomes convinced that spending will not stay in line with the revenue that can possibly be generated from the tax base. In the 1970s, acceptance of the rational expectations paradigm was slow. Many felt the level of information and rationality assumed on the part of the public was too high. Yet the other assumption that we had been using did not work well, and so this one became adopted. Like so many things in economics, we're good at analyzing extreme scenarios. We're not too good at the in-betweens. Because of this adoption, macroeconomic theory had to be reformulated to include intertemporal dynamics, and Thomas Sargent was a central figure here. A lot of the profession had to re-educate themselves. Graduate students and faculty together had to go essentially back to school, and Sargent's book was a tremendous help here. His book, Dynamic Macroeconomic Theory, which I would say many, many economists have a well-worn copy somewhere in their office. Sims and Sargent were cited for their contributions to modern empirical macroeconomics. Both Sargent and Sims rejected the big linear models used in the past. Both argued in different ways they were reduced forms, a mixture of behavioral relations. They argued that they were both incorrectly estimated and subject to change as the economic environment changed or as policy changed. To get an idea of the issues they raised, let's look at some examples. Suppose you wanted to estimate the effect of price on demand, but price typically enters both supply and demand. And you can see if they're both shifting, it's tough to estimate this reliably. Now, if you could exclude from the variables that affect one, say, for example, you could exclude rain from affecting demand and leave it in for supply, you have a way of identifying the parameters of the demand function. Now, I have a few sets of equations, and I promise to make this quick and easy. Okay, let's look at another example. Suppose you have a structural model. The issue, similar to the picture, is that you got X here and Y there. What you're interested in are these typically, which are the unanticipated effects of the policy, especially monetary policy. So suppose you had here an equation of money and say output. So you're trying to figure out, this was a big question at the time, whether money could cause output. Okay. Now, Sargent took one approach and Sims took another. What Sargent did was first of all, you gotta, all right, I know this looks bad, but just stick with me a couple minutes. First of all, you had to put X and the two lags over here, and Y and the two lags over here. And then you have shock terms that are sort of a mixture of the original equation. So when you actually estimate it, it looks more like that. Now you can see what the problem would be. If this is your estimate, you don't know what the original shocks were. You have to somehow go backward, right? Because if you're looking at this as a, say, monetary policy shock, it's tangled together in the equations you actually estimate. Now, what Sargent did was he would impose these restrictions, so he would estimate that, and then he would use theory to back out these things, including these important parameters here. And then once he backed that out, he would know which ones were the monetary shocks and which ones were the some other shock. Okay, now that is a common technique still used today, but Sims' contribution has become probably more dominant. Sims had a different philosophy. He started with the last set of equations, and his objection was you should impose as little on these equations as you had to get identification. In other words, every time you assume that a variable is in there or not, you're imposing your beliefs on the system rather than letting the system tell you what's happening. So you're not really doing as clean a job of testing your hypothesis. That was Sims' philosophy. So what he did was he started with this and then he worked backward. He said, well, okay, what's the minimum I have to impose on the system to get those shocks back again? This was called the vector autoregressive approach. And there's always a great deal of discussion about what you have to impose to disentangle these two shocks. But that's what he did. Okay. Now, another problem is, of course, this usually is not a two-equation system. Usually it's a multi-equation system. So it's hard to get causality when you have a multi-equation system like that. So Sims provided two new tools. He came up with impulse response functions and variance decompositions. Once we estimate the model, we can introduce shocks to the policy variable in question and then trace out the response of output. If the response is large enough, and now we have developed confidence bands, then the causality is inferred. Otherwise, causality is absent. Impulse response functions are useful for describing the sign and pattern of the response. Now, I'll show you a couple of these are kind of interesting. Here's one in a 1997 paper that Sims did with a bunch of other co-authors. And the question that he was originally interested in is, does money cause output? And you can see at least the monetary policy shock does appear to affect output. In this case, it's a shock of an increase in the federal funds rate. So his tentative answer is yes, it does. Another thing that one would look at is how much of the volatility in output is caused by these monetary shocks. In that question, it was somewhat low. One might want to know, is it 75% or 10%? Well, it turned out it was closer to 10%. There have been numerous extensions to the work of Sargent and Sims. Oh, here's another one. This was kind of interesting. This one is not by Sims, but by somebody using Sims techniques. The question here was a redo of Romer's paper, does an increase in taxes affect output? Romer and Romer, Christina Romer, the one that was an advisor in the Obama administration, and David Romer had done some work that suggested that the effect on output was really quite severe of a 1% increase in tax rates. So here's a paper that takes a vector autoregression approach and looks at it, and the argument was that Romer was too severe and that this still has a negative impact, but not as severe as Romer's original. And so that's the kind of practical application of these techniques that we're using today. There have been numerous extensions to the work of Sargent and Sims. Sargent and Sims themselves remain big contributors. Both are associated with the rational expectations method of analysis, which at the time was considered extreme. However, neither are dogmatic believers. Instead, they've moved on to new techniques that more closely model the actual behavior of people in the economy. Ironically, though, now shoppers compare competitor prices with their smartphones in the store, farmers get crop prices as they plow their fields, and financial traders get the latest Federal Reserve update as they eat lunch. So it appears we are evolving to the type of rational expectations economy they originally envisioned 30 years ago. For this reason, the theoretical and empirical techniques introduced by Thomas Sargent and Christopher Sims are sure to remain the foundation of macroeconomic analysis. Their Nobel Prize is well deserved. Some of policy relies on information lags. A lot of policy does. And as people get more and more informed, I think it's going to be harder and harder to affect the economy by using those lags. And that had been the strategy for all along, really. So it does kind of make one think about what's the way forward here in terms of making things better. You know, should we concentrate on trying to do policy by using these lags, or should we work more on making institutions stronger to withstand shocks so that when economic shocks do occur, that people have the ability to adjust to it?
Would their work explain today's economic situation where you have widespread economic weakness and a large budget deficit, large unemployment, no housing market, and yet corporate profits are the highest they've ever been relative to GDP? It seems like that's one piece of today's economy that makes no sense theoretically. I wonder how your work come into play and analyzing that.
Maybe I'll rephrase the question for, and see if I get this right. So I think the question is, could their work give some context to help understand the current economic situation where we have high deficits, relatively low taxes, relatively high corporate profits, and a poor housing market.
Stating more simply, everything in the country is weak, and yet corporate profits stick out as historically being massive relative to the size of the economy. And I just wonder where how their expectations work with.
So how do rational expectations, how can rational expectations theory be used to understand the relatively low corporate spending with wildly high corporate profits? Is that fair assessment?
Okay, there hasn't been a lot of formal analysis yet. We have this habit of waiting till the data comes in and then working on it. One might argue that future expectations are not such that people want to invest, and that's the problem. So they're going to wait until conditions get better.
So as long as you think housing prices are going down, there's no point in buying a house.
That's right.
Right.
Yeah, and how do you solve those kind of problems? It's tough.
So over the years, they've collected huge amounts of data, presumably, and are much better able to actually estimate the size of the effects of these equations.
Yeah, we thought there seemed to be a sort of a consensus that monetary policy worked. There was enough of an effect there to make it worthwhile using policy. I don't know what's going to come out of the current situation, though. The interest rate is low, we all know that, and it does not seem to be helping. We probably should have paid more attention to the Japanese experience, but I think the idea out there was that we thought we understood that as a breakdown of the banking system. But right now, the banking system has had 3 years to recover, and there is no sense that the funds are not available to those who are creditworthy. So it's not a banking system problem. And Bernanke focused on the banking system because his observation of Japan is that's where the problem was. So he worked, and focused a lot on that. And I think largely successfully. But now the problem, I think, is a little further down the stream, which is that the people who could do the investing choose not to. And I think the focus has to be a lot more on that. Why do they have that view, and what would it take to change it?
This sounds like a social science question as much as, well, I guess economics is a social science, but it sounds like the kind of things that sociologists or social psychologists would be interested in.
There has been a branch of economics that have started looking at expectation formation, how rational are they really, and such, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm.
I get the sense that the people who are doing this work are primarily focused on backing out some parameters from data to understand the relationship between inputs and outputs, rather than doing that more fundamental. Can you get data from social science studies or behavioral science studies that would help you to define the parameters that go into those equations, or the macroeconomic things?
No, that's exactly what they're doing. They're trying to take the stuff that they get at the micro level, which tends to be a little more reliably estimated, and they impose those on these identification issues. They impose those, and they've gotten pretty sophisticated with those. They've gone to Bayesian techniques so that they can sort of attach a confidence level to that. So yeah, that's what they're doing, and that's where this work has evolved to. There's been a lot of work along that line.
Any other questions from the audience? Nominate discussion. All right, so as they go on, and right, this is a lot of quantitative work, and over time, right, we've developed better data sets and more extensive data sets, and I'm guessing these guys are doing this work quite a while ago.
Yeah.
So that they wouldn't even be able to deal with the kinds of data sets that are fairly commonplace now. Mm-hmm. How has that development changed the sense of what the parameters are in those equations? I mean, there's on one hand, times are changing and we're in different historical situations, and the parameters may be actually, the underlying parameters may be changing. On the other hand, our ability to specify
Well, if I had given this talk several years ago, I'd say we've been making great progress. I don't know if we can really do that right now. Clearly, this is a huge shock. I think it's safe to say there's a certain amount of disarray in the field, just like there was in the 70s. What will come out of that will be kind of interesting. It's an interesting time to be a macroeconomist. I guess this is not a reassuring thing to say to the public, but that's the situation.
I find it actually kind of refreshing. I was afraid that economists were looking at the current situation and felt that they understood it. Certainly the people I read in the New York Times and the Wall